Welcome to the Alain Elkann interviews, an unprecedented window into the minds of some of the most well-known and respected figures of the last 25 years.
He found too narrow the limitations of the canvas. He was obviously painting and so on, but then he found this too limiting. And then something changed in 2001 when he was affected by the destruction of the 3,000 years old Bamiyan Buddhas in Afghanistan. So can you tell me more about this passage in your life? What happened? Why did you decide that the canvas was too small or too limited and you changed your work?
If you think about the history of painting, there are 60 to 70,000 years of application of paint to a flat surface. That's what painting is. It's the application of color to a surface. But I always found the surface very restrictive in as much as that when you've expanded to the edges, when you've finished what you're making, the limitations of the painting is the limitations of the surface. When I started painting, I didn't have a formal training, so I didn't know how to organize composition. One day I made a painting where I didn't fit everything into the painting, and I suddenly realized that the problem that I was having with painting is that I wanted a more organic system of painting, where I wasn't limited by the flat surface of the canvas with an edge where you stop. I wanted a more organic version where paintings could grow and have unlimited ability to expand in height, width, and depth. So I developed techniques for making objects out of paint to try to take painting to a place where, by utilizing sculptural processes, I was making paintings only with paint. You couldn't deny that they're paintings because they're only made out of paint. But the processes of production are traditional sculptural techniques, carving, casting, cutting, for example. So that's the digression that I made away from the sort of standard format of painting, as I like to call it.
What happens because you are affected by destruction, right? Or degradation of events. So what happened when the Buddhas...
The background to that is a very simple thing. My grandfather ran an art gallery in London between 1958 and 1965. And one of the artists he represented was Lucio Fontana. So I was very familiar, even though he died long before I was born, there were books in my home. And I was familiar with the idea of opening the picture plane, that the cut, which most people consider damage to the surface of this pristine template, which becomes a painting, opens the field of the painting up. So I was aware that rupturing the surface could be constructive in a new way, if you think about it in a particular structure in mind. But when I saw the Bamiyan Buddhas being destroyed, I realized that there was a level of destruction and deliberate targeting of culture, which took this to a completely different place. It was the first time that I'd had to contemplate what was happening. Afghanistan was an extraordinary example because the remit of the Taliban was to flatten the culture that existed previously and put their imprint over the top of it. I couldn't get the damage imagery out of my head. And 6 months later, September the 11th happened, and I stopped making abstract assemblages out of blocks of paint, and I started making art about what was happening around me.
But then you were 6 months later affected by 9/11 in New York. You consider all that a deliberate destruction of culture, right?
Absolutely. In the same way that the Bamiyan Buddhas represented a system of belief, a way of life, a representation of an alternative to what the Taliban represented, and therefore they felt they had to destroy it. The Twin Towers represented similar notions, but to a Western capitalist society. And so they were attacked for the same types of reasons.
This became somehow the fil rouge of your work, because you were also more recently in Spain, you were touched by these excavations in Spain, where there were the remains of the bodies of people who were thrown into these holes during the War of Spain.
And during the Franco era.
Right.
Free-thinking people, artists, writers, simply people who dissented, even just on a very, very low level with the Franco government, would be taken away and killed, put into mass graves. That is not unrelated system of control to what the Taliban do nowadays. It's just the Taliban do it in a rather more extreme fashion in a different geographic location. Of course, both Franco's government and the Taliban killed people to stop them speaking. And if you don't have freedom of speech, that's the first rung on the ladder to expressing yourself and being able to literally be free. So these are markers of damage to culture, the repression of culture, the flattening of culture to impose upon it something else. And that little description fits the Bamiyan Buddhas, Franco's Spain.
How did you reproduce this in your art? What is the language that you use to express your rage?
I use 3 or 4 different systems. One is alginate, dental putty, which I take to places where damage is being done to culture. I make molds with the alginate of broken sculptures, the broken surfaces of sculptures, or of bullet marks, such as these. This is a Taliban bullet hole painting behind me. Or I gather up materials that I find in these places, such as charcoal, where buildings have been burned, for example, the Mosul Museum, or more recently, carbon capture, which is the soot, which I scrape out of exhaust pipes. And I use the charcoal and the soot as either paint or printing material. And I make prints and I make paintings which document what's happening.
You will have soon in Florida, if I'm not wrong, at the end of this year, 2025, you will show some of your work, about the loss of protected nature.
That's absolutely right. Yeah, cypress swamps. These are primordial territories. They're swamps which are clusters of cypress trees, which are many thousands of years old. They're buttress-rooted trees, so that the trunk of the tree widens towards the water which they live in. And they are habitats originally for indigenous people who lived all over Florida, huge numbers of them. Nowadays, it's all of the predators which live in marshes and swamps, which are connected to the Jurassic era. So turtles, alligators, dragonflies, even the flora and fauna are very, very ancient and largely unchanged. And these areas of land are being cornered and drained by development, property development, expansion of roads, turning fields into shopping malls, for example, which I witnessed personally because my parents lived in Florida and we had a cypress swamp literally 10 feet behind the back gate of our garden. And now it's a lawn.
So there are different types of degradation and destruction in your mind. Degradation and destruction because of the violence and the ignorance of war, or destruction for financial purposes, which is very similar in a different way to the battle that I think Richard Attenborough, the English filmmaker, is trying to show on the destruction of the seas, and the fact that because of fishing or wild fishing and no respect for nature and things like this, we are destroying our world.
Right, absolutely.
So this is more or less similar in a way to your art. That's what I think you try to convey,
That's absolutely right. Yes, it is. It's very similar, if not the same narrative. Ultimately, there are 3 different forms of destruction of culture. Most of it happens during wartime, because industrial scale machinery and explosives can be used to destroy a culture of a place. For example, think about Ukraine. That's exactly what's going on there. I traveled a lot to Iraq between 2015 and last year and have looked at it incredible length and at great depth there. And it's very, very similar. It's really the same thing, except, for example, that Russia has taken the knowledge of ISIS and is implementing their tactics against Ukraine. So that's the war side. Another area of destruction of culture, another reason that destruction of culture happens is because of the expansion of agriculture. That's then usually followed by the development of land. Fields clear land and make them usable for construction and for commerce, and then construction and commerce move in afterwards. So those are the 3 main causes of destruction of culture, which includes, like you said, the natural environment.
What is your answer through art to this? I mean, is it violent? Is it soft? How would you describe your anger, your horror vis-a-vis all this?
I'm acutely aware that I'm just one person and there's a limit to what I can do. but I try to understand these situations and express them through the art in order to put the material and the knowledge which I'm accumulating into the public domain to help people to understand. If people don't understand, they can't choose to change their attitudes or their way of thinking, their approach to dealing with the location or its products. So, for example, if you think about beef, which comes from Brazil, it's a good example. I think that the root of all destruction of culture is a lack of education. I think if you have an education in which you're challenged to come up with theories and ideas and then defend them against criticism, by doing this, you're taught to formulate ways of thinking and approaching the world in which you have a comprehensive capacity to decipher and then effectively pass down knowledge. Testing for passivity and obedience isn't a way of doing that. So multiple choice exams, for example, don't teach you anything. They just teach you to remember what you've been told and repeat it.
When you see these images, I mean, you do art, but everybody can see horrifying images. As much as we were horrified by the images of the Second World War and the concentration camps and all that, today we are seeing images in Ukraine, in Gaza, in other countries, of horror and total destructions of buildings, houses, hospitals, homes. How do you react to that? And then my question is, if you do sculptures or your artwork multidimensional, who show that, do people want to have this work of art in their homes, to be remembered, the horrors, or not? How is your work perceived?
How do I react to it? Was the first thing that you asked. If I have the capacity to, I will go to the place, try to understand it in as much depth as possible, speak to local people, understand from local government, usually from both sides of the coin, what's happening, talk to everybody I can, get as comprehensive a knowledge as I'm able to, and then try to make work about what's happening and explain and present it. That's how I deal with it. How do people absorb what I make? Sometimes people come into art galleries and see my work and cry. For example, I made an exhibition in New York in 2017 presenting relief sculptures which had been damaged by a sculptural process by imprinting on the relief sculptures molds of damage made by ISIS in Iraq. And because there's no veil of the media in between a physical reality and the human experience, it's very visceral and people become very emotional. So do people take them home? Actually, yes. Amazingly, people do. Not in enormous quantities, but the works on paper are much more beautiful and they're much easier to live with. And they don't scream problem in the same way that the violent surfaces, the ruptured surfaces of Assyrian sculptures from Iraq do. Those are harder works, but artists, the art collectors rather, who like art that challenges them, and they take the art which they buy and they collect and they live with very seriously, buy these works.
Yeah, because you show them on the form of a metaphor, right? Which art somehow is a synthesis of the horrors. It's a kind of remembering. Sometimes you feel, I'm sorry to use this, but you feel useless. The fact that art symbolizes, remembers, but unfortunately doesn't have a big impact because things repeat themselves in a way or the other. Violence, horrors, the new Pope is preaching for peace. All men of religions, they preach for peace, but then there are religious wars as well. It doesn't seem that the world, even with technology, new medicines, new research or whatever, hasn't changed really the essence of the violence in the world.
It does appear to be that case. However, there are many billions of people in this world, and if people feel comfortable and brave enough to speak and to press their sentiments, the leaders of nations ultimately will have to do what they want. That's one of the great wonders of democracy. You get what you vote for. If people decide across an entire nation that they are going to demand and refuse to go home until their demands are met, then governments have to concede. We see this quite often in France when people protest in the streets, especially, for example, the farmers relatively recently, and they just simply refuse to go home until the government concedes to what they want. The mass of the population is much more powerful than 20 people sitting around a cabinet office desk. So one of the ways in which I try to move forward my intention to tell the world what's happening is to interact directly with the governments who are involved. So, for example, in 2018, I was asked to organize a collaborative exhibition between the Kurdish regional government and the Baghdad government representatives to the UK. So the Iraqi ambassador and the Kurdish high representative to the UK. They had been at war with each other. Their respective militaries, the Peshmerga and the Baghdad Iraqi army, had been at war with each other over the city of Kirkuk, which ultimately the Peshmerga withdrew from and handed over to Baghdad in order to prevent the city being destroyed in the same way that Mosul was. So when those two parties asked me if I could help organize a collaborative project in the form of an exhibition of my ISIS-related art, immediately I said yes, because I saw it as an opportunity to try to somehow bring these parties together. I had no idea how I was going to do it, so I followed their guidance. And some of these people still speak to each other on a regular basis, but initially were completely unwilling to even enter the same building. So there is in every person's life the opportunity and the possibility to try, if you want to improve just a little tiny bit the way that the world functions. And I'm very, very certain that art has a role to play in that if artists choose to utilize it that way.
It is interesting that when there are totalitarian regimes, right, in all the countries where this happens, they make monuments. They did monuments in the past of the kings, of the emperors, and then now they make monuments of the tyrants. And as soon as there is a revolution, the first thing people do is to destroy these monuments. The busts of Mussolini, the Saddam Hussein of this world. Now, I don't say that these monuments are all works of art. Some are, but there is an immediate rage against these symbols.
Absolutely, of course, naturally. And the people who tear down those symbols are the people who feel most strongly what those symbols represent and feel most strongly their hatred towards them. And there's an interesting context to exactly what you've just described, which is that in the occupied regions of eastern Ukraine, Russia is putting back up all the statues of Marx and Lenin and Stalin. Putin clearly sees himself as one of their equals, but he can't follow from them if the busts and sculptures of them are gone. So in Russia, they're putting those statues back up as well.
Because of your work, do you have enemies? I don't say critics who say that your work is good or bad, but these countries, these places, these events that you criticize with your work, I mean, from ISIS to the Taliban, are they aware of your work? Are they annoyed by what you do?
Yes, they are annoyed, and yes, they are aware. And if we weren't recording this conversation, I would tell you a little bit more about it, and I would tell you more about it off the record. Perhaps we can do that separately. But suffice to say that that risk has become a reality in my life at one stage very recently. And I was advised by local government authorities what to do about it. I'm not going to go any further, but suffice to say that, yes, my life has been at risk.
Yeah, so in your work, you take risks. As you said, you're not painting portraits or landscapes or abstract paintings.
Let me show you a landscape, which is in my studio at the moment. But that's made with the carbon capture, which is, sorry, do it again.
What is it?
So that's sunlight shining through the trees in a cypress swamp in Florida. It's not finished yet.
But this is like a painting, isn't it? Or it's a sculpture?
It's a painting on paper.
You're not only sculpting, you also paint.
Yeah, I came back to painting with a paintbrush, which I thought for a long time I wouldn't do. But I feel that the need to make the work in a way that the work is most directly communicated is probably most effective. I could make this by a sculptural method, and I have a way of doing it where I effectively create each pixel, like a tiny little almost like a micro mosaic. I could make this in the same way, but I would need hundreds and hundreds of hours to make the objects, the little multicolored, hundreds of shades of gray between white and black to produce this. And it becomes about the process of manufacturing. I would need a much bigger studio. I would need probably 4 or 5 people helping me. I don't have the funds. It's much more straightforward for me to take the carbon capture, the soot in the exhaust pipes, turn it into an ink and paint with it.
What kind of relation do you have with photography, filming?
Photography and filming is extremely important for me because since about 2018, when I travel to places like Iraq, while the war against ISIS was happening, I was filming continually with a GoPro camera. And then I was told by people who understand the work and what I'm doing and why I'm doing it, you should actually really be traveling with a camera crew. So from 2018, I started traveling with a professional camera operator. So that is an effective system of documenting through film what I'm doing. I take a lot of photographs. These paintings, the one I just showed you, for example, that's made from a photograph. So photography and film are becoming increasingly important.
Do you have examples of other artists in the present or in the past that you believe they belong to your same world? They are inspired by the same horror for deliberate destruction of culture, which is ultimately what you're fighting for, right?
Yeah, I think that in my personal feeling, Alberto Burri is the most effective influence for me in that domain. And then moving forwards into contemporary times, of course, the person who stands on the highest pedestal today internationally is probably Ai Weiwei. But then you have interesting artists such as Olaf Eliasson, whose work is devoted to understanding the nature of human interaction with the environment. So there are a great many artists making work which have an underlying sense of urgency about where humanity is taking itself. And I look to those people continually, and I listen very carefully to what they have to say. I may not be as effective as they are. I don't have the international platform that they do. But if I can make contributions such as that diplomatic effort between the Kurdish authorities and the Baghdad authorities and help them to bridge the lack of communication which existed, then I'm doing something that's really worthwhile, and I continue to do it.
You denounce destruction, right, of culture and of people and wars and everything. Is there a little bit of hope in your work?
Absolutely. They're all hopeful. I make the work so that in the future, people can learn from them. The desire to be educated and the need to be educated and the facilitation of education is based on hope. Hope that you can teach the next generation and that they can avoid the problems of the prior generations.
So you picture, let's say, with different techniques, or you witness in your way these horrors, but you do it so that this will not be repeated, right? I mean, in order to teach, this is what happens, but you shouldn't do it, right? More or less. That's the hope.
That's the hope, naturally. Absolutely right. When Saddam Hussein was arrested by the American authorities in Iraq, the Kurds realized that they were really completely free now. And so they went to their libraries, which were filled with multiple volume biographies of Saddam Hussein and his versions of history. And they looked at those and they said, now we could take those out the back and burn them and be done with that history forever. It's so much pain, 130,000 Kurds died under Saddam. Or we can take a step back from it and we can say, this is a lesson from history, which we absolutely cannot forget. So let's close this section of the library off and keep it. And anybody who wants to understand what that type of authoritarianism in Iraq looks like can come here and examine it and understand it for themselves. That encapsulation, in order to facilitate understanding in the future, is what ultimately I'm attempting to do.
Besides the upcoming Florida project, what are your other projects? What are you thinking or working now? What is your obsession at the moment?
I've been working for 5 years on a project relating to the German occupation of a British Channel island called Alderney. And when I started looking at the occupation of Alderney, this is World War II, when I started looking at the occupation of Alderney, officially 355 or 357 people had died on the island. Those were forced and slave laborers taken from 30 different countries who were brought there to build concrete fortifications as a deterrent to the invasion of France by the Allies. In reality, I understood that I feel very strongly that around 2,000 to 3,000 people died on that island. So I started researching it. The more I researched, the more material I found. And that has snowballed as a project. The exhibition which I organized about it was from February to March 2023. 2 months after it closed, the UK government opened an inquiry into what happened on Alderney. And they officially changed the numbers of dead on the island up to 1,100. I think it will go much further in time. In presenting the exhibition, I presented a large volume of data from archives around the world, especially one archive inside the US National Archives, in which there was a wealth of information about Alderney, which had never seen the light of day. Part of the reason I put that exhibition together was because there was a personal connection, which is that the guns on Alderney fired at my grandfather in an airplane which was flying into the Cherbourg Peninsula the night before D-Day. He was an American Pathfinder paratrooper. He was a commander of the Pathfinders, and they set up beacons the night before D-Day to guide in all the airplanes at daybreak. So because the guns on Alderney had shot at him, it sort of made it rather personal. So that's a project which I've been working on for 6 years now, almost 7 years. And it's moved the needle on the understanding of what happened on that British territory, on which there was a concentration camp, possibly two, depending on how you define the definition of a concentration camp. It's considered slightly different in France and England to Germany.
Through your work, since you told me several things, I believe that you have the feeling that ultimately art can influence events, can influence things to happen, governments to reconsider some positions or to
Absolutely.
study deeper. And you take, memories of your own past in a way, and you try to bring it on the light spot somehow, right? To say, look at this.
Absolutely right.
Therefore, you like to dig.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I go down the rabbit hole.
You could have been an archaeologist.
Actually, quite a famous archaeologist recently told me to stop what I'm doing and become an archaeologist. And I said, but I'm not an archaeologist, I'm an artist. And we both laughed. But yes, in terms of research, I go down the archaeological rabbit hole, let's say that. Yes, your description is exactly right. And I can give another example. Paula Rego, very famous Portuguese painter, her abortion series of paintings and prints was so humiliating to the Portuguese government that they changed the law to allow abortion to be carried out as a formalized medical process because so many women were dying as the result of badly conducted abortions, which left them with hemorrhages or infections that ultimately killed them. So, yeah, there's no question whatsoever. And there are actually plenty of examples how art can influence government.
So you say that that kind of art is a voice. There is a lot of noise. There are lots of news and fake news, and people are bombarded by news. So they probably don't even know what to think about. Instead, you try with your work to take big but small examples, and you go deep and deep in order to really show something, right? That you believe has happened, and you research, and so on and so forth.
Correct. One of the things that's interesting about this process is that when I start getting into the core of the issue, I'm often contacted by government people who ask if they can help. So, for example, in Iraq, I was connected to Jalal Talabani, who was the leader of the Kurds for many years, and his very long-term partner. They never actually got married. Her name was Herohan, who became a personal friend. And they enabled some of the things that I wanted to do because I wanted to go to places where I wasn't able to, and they helped facilitate access. Those government authorities have never tried to limit what I'm able to do or edit what I make, but they have often facilitated. So, for example, I've known 3 consecutive Iraqi culture ministers and the heads of the state boards of antiquities and heritage, and they've always helped facilitate what I'm doing. And I know that I'm on the right path when those people start contacting me. And it's happened multiple times through multiple projects. So I know that there are people in governments all over the world who genuinely want truth and want reality and education. And enable what I'm doing because they see that I'm moving in that direction.
Do you do all this by yourself or you are helped?
With the Alderney project, I had a small team of researchers who helped me. They were mostly retired professional academics and professional researchers who I contacted because I was recommended, this person can probably help you, for example, to translate German Gothic script. And I found a fellow in Germany who I was introduced to, and he said, I'd love to do this. He was retired. He wanted a project that was engaging. And this happens often. I have an assistant periodically in the studio, and to help me with admin, I have another who's very effective with filmmaking and Photoshop, but that's the limit of it.
And are your works in many museums around the world? Which are the countries where you feel better known and understood?
The timing of your question is perfect, because on Saturday, I heard from a print publisher who I'm working with that the British Museum are acquiring 5 prints which I've made with charcoal from the inside of the burned Mosul Museum in Iraq. So that's an extraordinary thing. I have work in the Iraq National Museum in Baghdad and in the Mosul Museum. I have work in the Victoria and Albert Museum, now very shortly the British Museum as well, the UK Government Art Collection, the 9/11 Museum in New York bought work from me last year, and we're in conversation continually for around a decade at this stage. So museums do know me. They're starting to acquire the work. There are a number of others as well. For example, the University of Southern California have a small art museum, and their Center of Photography owns some silkscreen prints made with crude oil, which come from photographs that they own the copyright of. So there are a whole number around the world. Some of them are very small. The Texas Energy Museum in Beaumont in Texas, for example. But the information is getting out into the world. The art is getting out into the world. And
But you do everything in London? Your work is made in London, or?
Yes, 90% of my work is made in London. And my wife is a New Yorker. She has a very small studio apartment in New York. And when we're in New York, which has to happen fairly frequently for her work and for mine, I make drawings in the apartment. So I continue to work there. But most of what I make is produced here.
So you need a lot of energy to do your job, right? Intellectual energy, courage, to be aware a lot of what's going on, and then find the vehicle, the material to express it.
Exactly. It takes a lot of time and effort and energy to do the research so that I understand a situation well enough to feel that I'm portraying it in the work in the way that is genuine to my sentiments about what I've understood. So the research side takes a long time. And having researchers who can help me is incredibly valuable, because that means that I have more studio time. And that's ultimately where I need to be.
So we talked about lots of different researchers, past war, Spain, Germans during the war, Talibans, Iraq, Iran, Kurds, all this. And now, as we all know, we have 2 main wars, and there are many others. Sudan, in Gaza, in Ukraine, just to name some. How do you react to the contemporary events, or these contemporary disasters and contemporary destructions? I mean, are you tempted to do something in your own work?
I think that the war in Ukraine is the greatest existential threat to Western Europe since the Second World War. And so I've started traveling to Ukraine to understand as fully as possible what's happening there and to work out how to present that narrative in the work that I'm making. So that's a direct interaction. In respect to the shifting movement of politics to the right wing, which is happening internationally in the Western world, I find it extremely worrying. And it's part of the reason why the Alderney project was so important for me, because it serves as a warning from history. There's an idea, a notion that because the UK, England, Scotland and Wales especially are an island, that they are exceptional in some way, that there is an exceptionalism that would have carried over during the Second World War. The reality is that fascism and the Holocaust came to British soil, and that needs to be very clearly understood, because it's extremely important that people understand what that looks like, because it has happened in the UK. It has happened in Britain. And so that functions very effectively as a system of communication and discussion which can be applied very directly to the present day scenarios. We have to stop this swing of politics to the right.
Thank you very much for this interesting conversation.
Alain Elkann interviews.